some of you think that we don't know a damn thing, that we are just brainwashed robots, mindlessly promoting the official party line. Actually, we're okay with that. So keep it that way because it doesn't hurt.
Welcome back to another episode of Overlap. Very happy to be back with you here. I am Eugene Puryear from Breakthrough News, and this show is a partnership with our friends at Wave Media, a private media house in China, looking at all of the various ways China and the U.S. overlap and diverge to help break through all of the propaganda behind the Cold War atmosphere between the two nations. Today on Overlap, we want to talk a little bit about culture in the United States and China and the perceptions of the two countries that are driven by the mainstream media and the entertainment industry here in the United States in particular, and how that contributes to how both countries see one another and thus how policies can and could potentially be shaped. We are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show here today by Chris Young, who is an editor at Guansha, which is another private media house in China. And also he's making videos for Bilibili. He's commenting on Chinese social media. He's someone who has a great deal of knowledge about what's happening in both countries. And I have to say, Chris, I'm really excited to be here talking with you today.
It's my honor. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here, Eugene.
No, so excited to have you, and honestly, just really excited to even have this project, because I think one of the things, certainly for me, and I think for a lot of us who are watching, is we're often wondering not just what's going on in China, but what the perception is of American culture and American entertainment in China. I mean, we know that just like every other country, you're bombarded with the movies, the TV shows, obviously, your own perceptions of the news, and of course, the various, U.S. entities that are trying to influence the whole global stage. So I wanted to start really just by asking you some of how you saw that question. I mean, do people in China get, or what sense do they get of what's happening in the United States, the political debates and all of the different sort of controversies? I think a lot of them, we know on a daily basis. I don't know if they filter through to China, from cancel culture to, how racism plays out, to all the different things that are roiling our politics day to day. I wonder if people in China get a sense of that and how they view these different questions.
Well, that's a great question, Eugene. This is what I call an information deficit, or information surplus. I think China has the information surplus, and it's way more important than the trade surplus, in my opinion. In China, most Chinese students, they have this reading level proficiency in English. So they actively seek out information from multiple sources, including Western media, about the US. Whereas if you look at the US or any other Western country, it's only a handful of very elite students. They take up Mandarin classes, then they have some knowledge of China. So it's very difficult for them to access information in China, but it's relatively easy, well, despite the existence of the Great Firewall, that we are able to access information in the US. Let's talk about the Amazon show, The Rings of Power. I think that's something that's made a splash in Chinese social media. Because I knew in the US, people were criticizing the cast. They say, okay, these people are not supposed to play as elves because they are color. And in certain part of Chinese cyberspace, there are people who are sympathetic to that kind of racist argument. I think that's quite interesting. But I would like to hear what you say about it.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting question. And as you know, I mean, that's obviously, as you mentioned, such a huge undercurrent in the United States about Lord of the Rings. The same thing is true with The Little Mermaid.
Yeah.
To a lesser extent, the new Game of Thrones too, similar conversation around it. Now, some of I think the number one thing people say here in the US as a pushback is, well, these are all fantasy stories anyway. So,
exactly.
What does it really matter who plays what and who does what? But I do think that it hits on an interesting conversation here in the United States that has been so huge, certainly since the Trump presidency, But really going back to the 1990s in a big way when this started happening in Hollywood with more diversity, which is the two sides to the coin. Because on the one side, there is the issue of representation, the importance of representation, the fact that until really very recently, almost you think about the United States, which is a country that is almost at this point half non-white people. Depending on what state, it's actually a majority. But until very recently, the vast majority of people, I'm talking 80, 90% of people on TV and movies were white people and white people exclusively. And in fact, until Marvel put out Black Panther a few years ago, it was widely considered in Hollywood, well, nobody will ever watch a movie, with Black people as the stars because Americans are too racist. Now, of course, Black Panther showed that was not true. A lot of other things have showed that that's not true. And so now there's a push to have the culture be representative of the actual culture in real life, so that whatever sort of things that we're producing, it looks like when you walk out onto the street. I'm in New York City, but wherever you may be, and it's a very diverse country, even in places like Iowa, which have a reputation as being all white. If you walk around in Des Moines, you walk around a lot of these places, very diverse places, certainly much more than you would think. So really what's happening in Hollywood is a reflection of the fact that I think most people in the US want to see themselves portrayed not exclusively, but something like if I was to go out into the real world, it would seem like the people I'm seeing and I'm around. But that's one side to the coin. And the second side, I'll just drop in real quick, and I'm curious how you respond to that, is there is also a concern, I think, especially from progressive people, that the only focus is on the representational aspect. And so on the one hand, you can get a lot more Black characters, Latino characters, Asian characters in TV and movies, but you can't really get any significant change in the disparities that exist in terms of access to housing, where Black people especially have less access to housing, in terms of poverty, where the rates of poverty, which are pretty high in America, about 150 million people live in poverty, but more so among non-white populations. All these, obviously policing, which people have heard about. So it's almost like a concern that the sort of woke culture, if you will, is being used to it's almost like a narcotic to put people to sleep, right? Like, oh, well, we put more of you on TV, so it's okay. But in reality, there's all these other problems that aren't being addressed.
Eugene, I'm more sympathetic to the second rationale. We almost, especially the younger generation in China, we see woke culture, or we call it 白左. Bai zuo means white left or Western left. So it's almost become a laughing stock or insult on Chinese internet. I think that's one, because Chinese netizens are unaware of the existence of deeply structural, or if you will, systemic inequalities in the United States. So much so that you need to stay woke, stay vigilant all the time. I think it was a country for the white people. So it wasn't designed for the people of color. So the night is dark and full of terrors. Without that knowledge, Chinese netizens are easy to believe in the right-wingers, the rhetorics. If you look at Tucker Carlson, he picked up the trend in China and turned into a weapon against the progressive left on his show. He said, okay, the Chinese people are mocking us. In China, there are many people adopting US right-wing views on Black Lives Matter, feminist movement, gender equality, and so on and so forth. But bear in mind, in 1963, Chairman Mao published a statement supporting the American Negroes in their just struggle against racial discrimination by the US imperialism. It was well received by the likes of Malcolm X and so on and so forth. So I think that the key reason that 白左 or Western liberalism, Western leftism was laughed at was because liberalism, whose goal is to reform rather than burying capitalism, has taken over the vacuum left by communism or socialism, and that has grown so powerful that it becomes the new face of imperialism. It's almost like a liberal imperial order. So it's easier for Chinese netizens to identify with conservatism, traditional gender roles. They're under this umbrella of patriotism or nationalism or traditions. But we did that without understanding of nuanced differences of such terms in different cultures. What an American patriot means is vastly different from what Chinese patriot means. It can be very different politically. In China, it's almost a politically correctness to say, okay, you are a patriot. So you will say, okay, those American comrades, they are patriots too. So what they say must be right. And those insults they level at those BLM, etc., etc. We take it and we say, okay, that's the liberalists, the leftist, the Baizuo's evil scheme, to make people not really aware of the real injustices, which is the injustice among classes. Which is right, I would say. Yeah, Chinese people, they are not heartless. They are not heartless. They are sympathetic to real progressive causes. But it's just that they think liberalism is overreaching to China, and they want to resist that liberalism, especially new liberal ideology. So they look out to different ideas such as conservatism, such as nationalism, so on and so forth.
No, I think those are really, really well taken points, and I don't know, it brings a lot to mind. I mean, there's so much to say about all of this. It's so interesting. I mean, the first thing in a way is it does speak to me about how inadequate the entire mainstream American conversation is, whether we're talking about liberals or conservatives, really, because so much of what you're saying really does hit home, in a weird way, almost to how Americans are also affected by some of this. But, on the one hand, it is true that you have this powerful effort by liberal media. And I'm really glad you referenced the issue of Chairman Mao and, the message he sent in 1963, also 1968. There's a long, deep history of relationships. I mean, we could go way, way back. I mean, if we go back to the 1930s, for instance, 1940s, excuse me, during World War II, the Chinese Exclusion Act and the issue of the poll tax in the United States, the progressive Chinese American community and the African American community were working really closely together and saying these are two of the same type of racism, and the exclusion of Chinese people, the Jim Crow against blacks, it's all one thing. And in the context of World War II, this is the anti-fascist fight. So there's this long, deep history. But the reason I'm really glad you raise it is because, the role of the state in the United States in really crushing these more radical wings of the Black movement here in the United States is partially what opened up the space for a lot of this ridiculous liberalism that hasn't solved any problems. Because historically, the Black liberation movement has really been the centerpiece of the most radical movements in America. So when groups like the Black Panthers and others are killed, jailed, people are bought off, Malcolm X, of course, assassinated, it created a huge amount of political vacuum and political space. I won't go into the whole story here, but if we fast forward to today, and this is one of the things that I think is interesting about relating that history to China today, like even listening to the discourse around the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of China, and you still hear words like class struggle being used, socialism being used, as this is sort of our class struggle in a way, at least in the Black community especially, is there's all these liberals who are like, yes, we're going to talk about racism, we're going to talk about all these bad things, but then they won't actually do the things that are required to address them, because that means they have to address capitalism. And so you can have someone like a Barack Obama, he can become the president. I don't think he's a racist. Obviously, he's a Black man, but his impact on the Black population, and which is majority working class, majority poor, was very small, because to address the issue of inordinate housing, you look at even jobs. I mean, you'd have to have basically 100% employment amongst Black people who could work in America because of structural unemployment. You'd essentially have to create more jobs in a year than the entire economy creates for all workers. So obviously you would have to have a big change in the mode of production and how the structure of the economy in America to address that. And these big liberals, they don't want to address it at all, because they view it as, hey, capitalism's working for us. So they want to try to, use the the fact that they'll talk about it, the fact that they'll, do something in Hollywood, which is good. It's good to talk about it. It's good to have it, but they use that as a smokescreen. But then on the other hand, you have the conservatives. And this I think is interesting because, to be a patriot in America, which is a totally different concept. I mean, it's changing some now because of how time has changed, but traditionally it's associated with celebrating, the genocide of Native Americans, these, slave owners who were founding fathers. So there's a lot of complicated feelings for a lot of the country because it's like, well, we're celebrating people who are ancestors at that time. It wasn't so good. And I think the other side of that is to be an American patriot these days, especially from a right-wing perspective, also means to hate China. And the most patriotic people, I was just sort of an aside, but Tucker Carlson, I was just in Brazil recently. Right before I got there, he released this major quote unquote expose about how China is quote unquote taking over Brazil. And this is why Bolsonaro is so important. And this is the discourse amongst a lot of these conservatives, also many liberals too now, though, to be honest with you, is that, America is losing to China. And honestly, it's kind of a mirror image. And they say, okay, well, America, when we were quote unquote on top, was treating most of the rest of the world really badly. And it's almost like there's a fear of like, well, if China is able to rise, well, they're going to do the same thing that we did to everyone else. Now, there's no evidence of that, but it is this like anxiety that exists. And it means that like patriotism in America is really like now very centered on, American competition with China. China's bad, hate China, and all these other different things that come with it. So it's an interesting dichotomy that, people are seeing this. But long story short, and this is the final thing I'll say on that, I think the most important thing is how could anyone in China have a true view of America is kind of my fear and my worry when all they're getting is either like the liberalism, which leaves out all class struggle, all ideas of the context of the material basis behind racism, or these conservative media, which is just like hyper-imperialistic nationalism. That's the mirror image. I mean, neither of them really get a good sense of what's happening in the country.
I fear that too. I mean, it's all polarized because, well, the political landscape in America is highly polarized. So if you look at any media goods that are coming out of the press, it's got to be either pro-Democrats or pro-Republican. But when it comes to China, yes, there's almost consensus, yeah. So I think that's why we need to talk about this more often. So we need to create a bridge to foster mutual understanding. But before that, I thought there's something very important I want to respond. I think the Chinese people, the very fact that China is a socialist country since its inception and America is a capitalist country made a huge difference. Because liberalism, what it does is to make peace with capitalism. It means to gloss over those fundamental inequalities among classes. Whereas in socialism, the distinguishing factor of socialism is its emphasis on equality. So the Chinese netizens, they have this very long tradition of socialism. They are on the socialist left, so not on the liberal left. So when I see liberalism and imperialism go hand in hand in establishing a global order, globalist order, with elements of imperial hierarchy, not unlike the former British Empire. So in a way, Chinese netizens are sympathetic to the right because, well, they talk about taking back the country from the corrupt cosmopolitan elite. And we are sympathetic to that because, well, a lot of Chinese people, they see the U.S. as a country that is run by the elite, and the elite, they have vested interest in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, and it's almost like the sort of populist movement in the United States means the demise or potential demise of the US empire and reinstatement of the republic. So that's welcomed in China. But they are not well aware of the right wing's role in the past, like you said, its racist roots and its genocidal history. and they don't know their outlook of the world at the moment. How deeply entangled with white supremacy, and what they are capable of doing when they gain the upper hand in its battle against the liberal left. The Chinese people are not familiar with that. So when they see, okay, we have a common enemy, that is the neoliberal globalist elite. Okay, they say, okay, this must be our brothers in arms, but in fact, no, I don't think so. And I think that's why, exactly, coming to your second point, we need to talk more because, okay, China has this socialist tradition. I think you have a progressive channel, and we care about, we share many of the same concerns of our respective societies. So I think we should talk more.
Yes. No, I think that there's really nothing that can replace people to people connections, I think, in terms of, figuring a lot of this out. But yeah, it's an interesting point. And it's also speaking to the inflection point we're in, in the United States right now as a country. I mean, certainly you look at the right, having talked a lot about liberalism, but you look at the right, sort of the same thing, really. I mean, even though they have a lot of populist rhetoric, and Trump, very smart in how he brought that in. His program is driving down wages, eliminating workers' rights protections. You could argue actually the largest transfer of wealth from poor to rich of probably any president, $1 trillion transfer in wealth due to his tax cuts, which were only for rich people. So he has this, and I think in 2016, even a lot of progressive people were kind of, like, oh, this doesn't sound that bad, because he was hitting to the fact that the elite in the United States is totally venal, totally corrupt, totally inept. I mean, we're living in a country that, you have 15,000 bridges that could collapse at any time in the United States. Obviously a terrible situation. You would assume that the government would say, all right, well, let's just fix the bridges. But we just had a bill that was passed to allegedly fix the bridges. Biden's, infrastructure plan, the bipartisan infrastructure plan of Biden and the Republicans, so Democrats and Republicans, and they didn't appropriate enough money to fix all the bridges. So I think people in the US look around and just say, what kind of, ridiculous elite system do we have that we can't even fix the bridges? Forget everything else that's more complicated than that. And I think Trump, Bernie Sanders as well, who is coming from a left perspective, but in a sense, Trump was more effective than Sanders to some degree, because Bernie's a nice guy, where Trump was like willing to really get down and dirty. So it felt more oppositional. But then when he gets in office, it's, the same thing as everyone just before him. And so we have this kind of fake populist challenge where you've got sort of the right wing trying to claim it's the party of the working class. But then when they get in power, everything they do is against the working class and really for imperialism. Then you've got the liberals that say, oh, well, we're also for the working class and the most marginalized sectors, but they don't deal with it either. So we're sort of caught between this rock and a hard place. And that's why, it's important for us to talk more, because outlets like ours, like Breakthrough, we're trying to give voice to this huge subset of other people. I mean, there's so many polls that have been done on this, but like 40% of people under 30 or something like that in America support socialism. So that's a huge part of the population. It's tens of millions of people, but you can't turn on the TV and hear anything about socialism unless it's bad. Even the so-called Democratic Party channels like MSNBC or whatever that you think would want to have like one or two people who call themselves a socialist just to have it, they don't even have that. So you've got tens of millions of people who feel like I'm totally unrepresented in the country. And it's not only do they feel unrepresented in the media, but then you also have these other phenomenon that are coming to the fore, some of which I think is fueling the far right, which is that, there's a huge mismatch between skills and jobs. So this is sort of an older stat, but when I was graduating college, so this is like long before now, not that long before, but like, let's say 15 or so years ago, when the economy was, Obama administration, at that time, like 50% of college graduates or something like that, or something close to that, were working in a job that didn't require a college degree. So you've got this huge reality in America where there's not enough jobs. Beyond there not being enough jobs, there's not enough jobs that actually pay well for people. And so the social fabric of the country is totally collapsing. And you can see it with the opioid crisis, all these other things. Then you've got the internet, which is driving like this like niche subculture, you know, like the ability to just like sit at home and stay online and find people in little chat rooms or whatever that think just like you is easier than it's ever been. So you can sort of self-isolate. And I think this is a big thing behind this sort of incel phenomenon that a lot of people are talking about that is playing a big role. It's certainly in driving the right, but I think driving sort of mass violence and things like that is society is sort of crumbling all around us. People have less opportunity than they've ever had. The two major political parties are just not doing anything for anyone. And the media doesn't really seem to speak to people's problems directly. And so I think people are feeling a sense of loss too in the United States. And it's a real time of contestation and new ideas bubbling and rising, one of which is socialism. That's why it's getting more popular, but it's so unrepresented. You know, you're having to fight so hard to get into the discourse.
I mean, yeah, coming back to your points, the situation, the political situation in the United States is that the country has run into many problems. It has an overseas empire that is too big, too overextended to sustain, whereas it's got domestically great deal of problems to fix. But none of those parties, none of those elites, they would like to do it. So probably people were just too desperate. They need someone else from the outside, preferably. So they looked up to Trump. Could be a potential candidate to change the game completely. But then it was proven just another just another president. You mentioned earlier that China used its old rhetoric in the 20th Party Congress. But then I wish to say that there is something new. I found there's very interesting phrase. It said it's the Chinese way of modernization. Well, it's different from what was previously known as the China model, because China model is a model that others may look up to, and it has the potential to be exported. And if China were to play the role of a missionary, let's say, then it's bound to clash with the United States, who has been playing that role, spreading the gospel for a long time, you know. So if you go down the path of head-on rivalry, it's going to be a mortal struggle with the United States. So the best outcome could be what Khrushchev once said: "We will bury you." But you know, from a realist perspective, the U.S. empire will never tolerate a peer competitor, so it will strike back with full force. So I think this new way of phrasing it is more clever. It puts forward the idea of Chinese way of modernization. It's an implicit acknowledgement of the Western way of modernization, but also it's a gentle reminder to the West that, okay, modernity is not singular. Is not restricted to one Western version. We should imagine and develop different multiple versions of modernities. Well, that's just commenting on the 20th Party Congress.
No, I think that's super important. And, you know, I wish those were the things that were picked out by the US media, but of course they always just want to look for something bad that they can say anything about China somehow, some way. But I think it's an important concept because to me, it actually speaks very heavily to the conversation we're having here in the United States, which is, you know, how to change and improve our democracy in our country. And, you know, the way we've been doing it has not really brought us a lot of success, well, except for a handful of super rich people. So I think just the idea of considering multiple modernities, I think is important, A, to avoid competition, or this head-on collision rather. And I think also avoid competition. I mean, I think so much of the rhetoric that exists in the United States is like America competing with China. I certainly don't see it that way. Breakthrough News, we certainly don't see it that way. I mean, there's complementary realities where cooperation rather than competition makes sense, but also just the possibility that people can choose and develop their own path on the basis of their own historical experiences and their own contemporary experiences to whatever fits people the most. I mean, one of the things that I have pointed out a lot and that we often point out on Breakthrough News is, every few years, there's multiple people who do this. They do these huge surveys, and they say, okay, well, do you consider your country to be democratic, and so on and so forth. And way more Chinese people, huge percentages, always say they consider their country to be democratic, while very small numbers, I mean, like you'll have like barely getting half the population in America will say, if they might say the country's a democracy, but if you ask the question, like, do you feel your voice matters? It's a very insignificant number of people. And that to me speaks volumes, because like, what is quote unquote democracy other than what people feel it is? Like, if you feel your government is responsive to your needs, then we have to look at that, and we have to consider it's a form of democracy, maybe not the one that'll work in this country, but it's working for China, or it's working for whoever, in any country around the world. And I think that's a powerful message. And I think in a way, that is why there's so much anti-China demonization, because if you were actually listening to what was said at the 20th Party Congress, what is being said at the National People's Congress, what's generally being pointed out by the intellectuals, it doesn't actually sound evil and sinister, and they need it to sound evil and sinister. So they have to find a way to distort it on so many different levels. And I think that sadly, they've succeeded as of now, I think, of confusing a lot of people. But you can also see that it's not all the same. Like when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, the polling showed that the majority of people did not want her to go, because people could see like, well, wait a second, this is too warlike. We do not want these kind of realities. So there's a line, and I think a lot of people in America are like, yes, we should not go to war. I think a lot of people even say there shouldn't be a new Cold War. But since they don't really understand what's happening, they're manipulated into thinking that these new Cold War measures are really just defensive, or really just this or that. So I think it's an interesting point. And I think that, again, it keeps coming back around to the general theme, I think, of how powerful the US media, which by the way, is about 80% owned, or, something like that, majority owned by about 5 companies. And when I say 5 companies, we're really talking about the elite owners of these companies. They're big, huge, publicly traded companies owned by big investors. So this tiny clique of people who are basically deciding how China is going to be portrayed, not just in the news, but also in movies, different things like that, and controlling people's narratives, and also sort of preventing the reality of American people. I mean, just to go to an issue that conservatives bring up a lot about crime, everywhere in America, whether we're talking about the local news in the cities and the towns, or the big national news, portrays all criminals basically as Black, essentially. And you would never know that, according to all of the actual official statistics, the majority of people who commit crimes are white. Now, that makes sense because the majority of people are white. So there should be more just proportionally. So it makes sense. But since this is so huge, even in America, most people, honestly, maybe even many Black people, think that most crimes are committed by African Americans. And so it's like it seems like a small fact, because it's obvious, right? Like, well, okay, the majority of people commit the majority of crimes, but since it's portrayed so black and white, then everyone's perception of crime becomes deeply racialized. And so you have all these little things, that these false things that come out in the news that portray Americans, and then the mirror image the news gives us of China is also equally as distorted, and equally as misconstrued and decontextualized.
I think what we said keeps going back to media distortion. So I want to talk about, I want to go back to the beginning, where we had a friendly relationship between China and the West. And then over the years, we became increasingly disillusioned with each other. So there was a time when, panda huggers in the United States were, they wanted to change China to their liking through engagement, and China was eager to play along what was essentially a US-led order, because that represented progress, and China was so desperate to catch up. So in that stage, people in China opened up not only its borders but also its mind. People were much more receptive and willing to adopt Western ideas. So in a certain way, it's a reaction to its former Soviet legacy. So basically, that generation of Chinese people trusted Western media so much so that everything it said was accepted as objective facts. If they contradicted with reality on the ground, then our society must be somehow at fault and needed to change. So this trend lasted for decades until I would say until around 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. I recently listened to a BBC podcast when the hostess lamented that China was much more open, much more friendly, reform-minded. Back then, the China watchers in the West were euphoric because China to them was finally on the right path of convergence to the West. It was also around that time when Chinese nationalism started to grow and people realized we cannot become who you liked if it means that we shouldn't become who we like to become. So there was bound to be differences between cultures naturally. They started depicting China in a negative fashion, and Chinese people were hurt. Their self-esteem were hurt. And they started to wonder, okay, why wouldn't they just acknowledge that we have grown, we have developed, we have progressed? Over the years, the Chinese people become more and more disillusioned with the paragon of Western journalism, and people are open and actively seeking out alternative sources of information, including Western media. That's why they actively looked out for what the West has to tell about the Chinese story. But then they become so disappointed. And it comes back to what I call earlier information surplus and information deficit. We are more active in reaching out, in going out to seek information, whereas, English is the global lingua franca, and, we have this passing, knowledge of it, more so than the Americans have on Mandarin. So we get to know more about the West, and then it knows us. So we know what has been distorted. And we know that some of you think that we don't know a damn thing, that we are just brainwashed robots, mindlessly parroting the official party line. Actually, we're okay with that. So keep it that way because it doesn't hurt.
Yes. Well, if there's anything I can say about the elite consensus in America, they're definitely underestimating the nature of what, not only people in China, but around the world. I've been privileged enough to go around the world. People have a lot of information about the United States. We're the ones who have less. And, it's interesting too, because even just, I don't have any stats on this, but I just, as an avid Netflix watcher, have been noticing this. It used to be Netflix would put on a lot more movies from China.
Oh.
And, if it was big in China, they would probably put it on Netflix at some point because they figured Americans would want to know. I actually just recently watched a slightly older movie, The Wandering Earth, Chinese movie. I love sci-fi, great movie. But it's interesting that in the past couple years, many of the larger big box office movies in China, of course, have been about the history of China, and about the history of your struggle and your formation as a nation. And none of those movies have made it to Netflix. Now, it could just be a coincidence. It could just be random. They don't want to pay the money. They don't think anyone would watch it. But I don't know. The sort of conspiracy-minded part of myself feels like this almost feels somewhat deliberate. You know what I mean? That when it was just sort of action movies or whatever it may be, or love stories, or, something from 5,000 years ago, fine. That's all good. But when it's like the true history of, the Long March and
they don't want you to know. That's why you say stay woke.
Yes. No, it's true. It's true, but Americans, some of us, people like myself, we studied this, but most Americans have no idea about any of this historical context. But I'm sure many people in China have probably seen, multiple movies about the US in World War II and, the
Civil War, everything.
Civil War, exactly. And so, those are our foundational stories that mean so much to us, but we're so starved of this on the other side. And it feels deliberate. I don't know. I'm just making, I have no idea, but it does feel super deliberate to me. And I think that one of the more interesting factors is going to be, how do we excavate the history of the different periods in US-China relations where there were good relations, where there was peaceful competition and cooperation. I mean, you even go back to President Lincoln, who made one of his major points during the Civil War. Well, we're going to try to have better relations with China. There was the Burlingame Treaty, which, there's a whole long, rich, deep history of this guy Burlingame, who is a big time abolitionist. He goes to China as the US ambassador. He becomes then the person China picks to come to America. They sign this treaty, bringing in good relations between the two countries. It's an amazing history that even goes back to our foundational myths in America, and not just myths, but reality that people revere, but we don't know anything about it. So there's this long, rich history that I feel is buried, that in addition to the contemporary realities, you don't hear that China was very, very popular in America, especially amongst Black Americans in the 1940s. It was seen, in World War II, something many people in China probably don't know. When Americans gave blood for soldiers, it was segregated by race. Now, there's no difference, obviously, between blood, but they would segregate it by race. It was only the United China Relief that had a blood bank for people fighting in China against Japan that did not segregate the blood. So this was a huge story in America of, wow, the Chinese are not segregating the blood. Like, this is a sign of what they stand for. And there's so many different other points that I could make about that. But there are these beautiful moments in history that I think we've lost, that I think also can help enrich the conversation contemporarily. But it's just important for, I think, people in the U.S. and I think people in China to know that if the vector of information is the U.S. mainstream media, you have to be wary, because, like you said, it's very, very slick propaganda. I mean, it's propagandistic, but it's done in such a way to confuse people. I mean, you have 1,000 different channels, you've got multiple different people, you've got allegedly different viewpoints. And so it creates this sort of this idea that there's this, as we call it in America, the information marketplace, where all the different ideas are kind of battling it out equally. But the opposite is true. Like, a handful of ideas dominate, but anyone can start a YouTube channel in America. Anybody can get on social media. Anybody can have a voice, but can that voice be heard is a whole other question. But just the perception that is there, the perception that the media is nonpartisan, all these different things are very slick propaganda that I think Americans are not really hip to yet. But almost everything that's said on there is being said for a reason, and most of it is not to have truth and freedom reign, as the U.S. would like to say.
And Eugene, I think I just thought of something. I mentioned conviction earlier. I think the propaganda machine in China just lacks conviction. They don't believe in what they say. Whereas in the United States, I think a lot of the cultural elite, the intelligentsia, they believe in what they preach. And I think it goes back to the thing that's called objective moral order. Okay, they believe in their God, and that's the nature's God. There's one nature, one God, and therefore one set of law. So, and it becomes the basis of universal values. You have the same singular standard across cultures. They say no to cultural relativism. If you look at Cicero in the Republica, it says something like this: there will be no different laws from Rome to Athens, or different laws now and in the future, but one internal and unchangeable law will be valid for all nations and all time. We know it's not the case. For laws will vary and change from nation to nation, from time to time. But then this idea of single Western standard should be adopted to gauge morality across cultures. I think this is Western hubris in its purest form, because the West started early. It got so developed. So it thought was in a position to completely disregard other cultures' values, and and those values were derived from their own unique historical experiences, and those experiences were discounted as unimportant. So if one culture's gravest concern means nothing to you, and you could continue to ignore it, for example, let's say Ukraine and Russia, the NATO wanted to expand in 2008, they ignored Russia's red lines. The only thing mattered to them was to create a pro-American liberal democracy in Ukraine, because Well, that was the right thing to do for them. Everything else didn't matter. So it's almost like a Manichean struggle between angels and demons. Everything you say or do is wrong because I myself is self-righteous. If I were right, then you must be wrong. I fight on God's side or the good side. So if you disagree, you must be inherently evil, and therefore I must overcome. So this kind of mentality, I think, it plays a certain role in the journalists' understanding of China because China is different, is visibly different. And if they are, America is a shining city on the hill, then China must be a dark place.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. I think most of the American journalists do believe because, I mean, that really is our education system is, America is not only the greatest country at the current moment, but the greatest
All
idea
time.
for a country that has ever existed and ever will exist. And
Yeah.
people really take that to heart. And I almost think that there's a feeling of almost an inferiority complex too that helps drive that now vis-a-vis China because you can see the US ambassador to China posting his selfies from a train saying I'm on this great train going 300 miles an hour and this is such an amazing piece of technology, and we don't have one train in America that's even close to that. I mean, the only so-called high-speed train in America is not even a high-speed train. It's honestly unbelievable, but it is like $300 more expensive. But all that being said, I think that it almost is like, well, they must be doing something evil. If they've found some way to have, high, well-functioning infrastructure in China, it must be evil. There's no way they could actually have found a way to do something that the US could learn from. There's no way that there's something we could take from that and do for ourselves. It must be some sort of sinister thing in the background. And you definitely see that play in with the preconceived notions of US journalists in China. For better or for worse, I follow many of these mainstream journalists who live in China, who report from China for CNN and other places. And everything, everything is negative. It's just, I've been a lot of places in the world, and I don't know how you report everything is bad. I mean, there's no place on earth where that is the case, but it's all cast negatively, and just the assumptions that are put into place when you hear them talking, hear them reporting, or even if they're trying to say something is somewhat good, they're trying to find some way to say, well, it must be bad. And the only reason you would do that kind of thing is because mentally you really do believe that. You came with preconceived notions, you don't want to change them. And I think my experience in US media as a journalist has been that's super widespread amongst journalists in the United States, is that they really feel like they know it, that they have it, that we've perfected the values and the craft of journalism, and anything outside of that is wrong, and that any preconceived bias that we bring to the table is not actually bias, it's just right, because that's exactly the way we look at it. And I think that on so many countries, and I think the Ukraine piece is amazing. I mean, I don't know if of any mainstream media outlet really in America that even really discussed the issue of not only Russia's red lines, but the long history of NATO. It was like the past 30 years of American policy didn't even exist. Just all of a sudden, one day there is this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia's evil, and they invaded, and the U.S. has to stand up. And it's how can you call yourself the media without even bringing in these basic points? And you can see anybody with these views never gets on the mainstream media. I mean, there's a big controversy right now. Jeffrey Sachs, who is a big time intellectual in America, he was a big player in the Clinton administration. Twice recently on television, he's been cut off when he's been raising questions. He said on Bloomberg, well, I think the US bombed Nord Stream 2, and they cut him off right when he said it. Recently, he was at some big time forum, some big intellectual forum, and he said, well, I think the US has been one of the most violent countries, and they cut him off right when he said it. And it's just like, this is literally one of the most influential intellectuals in America for 40 years. And he can't say, he can't say things that are basically at least close to the truth, or at least reasoned perspectives. So I think it gives you a sense of how scared the US media landscape is about anything seeping in that can break the consensus.
Talking about Jeffrey Sachs, I think the most valuable, the most wise words he says is that is also a very simple idea, is that different cultures, they all have merits, okay? So it's better to not to make quick judgments based on simple standards. Simple as that. I mean, but this idea is, I think people understand it theoretically, yes, but then in daily practice, they don't. Yeah, they don't get it.
Yeah, no, I think people are deeply confused, unfortunately, and there's a lot to be said. But that's, I think, why it's good that we are able to have these kind of conversations and have this kind of show. I
Yeah,
think to show people that, obviously cultures are very different, but there's a lot of similarities, I think, about what people really want. People want to live good, long, decent lives with themselves and with their families, and they want to find a way that, based on their own culture, they can do that in the most sustainable way. And I think that's a powerful linkage between peoples in a lot of different ways. And I think whether we're talking about climate change and sustainability, whether we're talking about poverty, I mean, on many of these questions, the average Chinese person, the average American person, I think, aren't that far apart on the basic core values of what they want to see. Maybe different ways of getting there, maybe not. We'll have to see. But that's like, without the kind of conversations and convergence, we can never get there. And I think, honestly, this is why for us, we do what we do, and Breakthrough News and other people who do independent media, because it really is there. I mean, I can't even really overstate
yeah,
how many tens of millions of people in the United States. I mean, just to go back to Bernie Sanders, I mean, he was twice the runner-up in the Democratic primary. So he got tens of millions of people voted for him. But on no mainstream network in America is there a regular commentator that's like a Bernie Sanders supporter or follower or someone in his political camp. So there's like these huge subsets of people who are just totally underserved. And then, of course, not only are they underserved in terms of what we receive, we're underserved in terms of how our stories are told. And it's a huge challenge, but that's why we're here.
yeah. I think yes, you said it all. Um, I think the current situation between U.S. and China is obviously not beautiful, and I think it's due to the inability to understand each other's perspective and predicament. You can say the same. It's true for the U.S. side to China because it doesn't understand China, where to a certain extent it is the same in China that we couldn't understand, for example, social justice in the United States. What are you people fighting for? I think it's very important that we convey this message to across a wider platform. So our conversation could serve as a bridge between our cultures. So upon this bridge, we can build a shared future. That's what China would like to say to the world: the shared future, a better world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chris, I hope this is the first conversation of many. I was thrilled to have
Yes.
the opportunity to meet you, to have this
Thank you,
conversation.
Eugene.
I
Thank you
love
for
this
having me.
show, love Overlap. This is like a great, great
Love it.
opportunity. So I just really appreciate you chatting with me, man.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.